31 people had tried to get through to Diane Ashford in the 2 years since the accident. Contractors, consultants, project managers, assistants, some lasted a day. One lasted 4 hours. None of them lasted long enough to matter. Then a single father from Columbus with $40 in his checking account and a 7-year-old waiting for him at home walked into her building. Not because he thought he could handle her. Not because he believed he was different from the 31 who came before. He walked in because he had no other choice. And because of everything that came next, she would eventually offer him $1 million to walk back out. He didn't take a single dollar. If this already has you, tap like and tell me what town you're watching from. Now let's begin. The building was called the Meridian, which was either a poetic choice or a coincidence, and Caleb Mercer wasn't in the mood for poetry the morning he pulled into the parking structure on Grant Avenue and sat in his truck for 3 minutes trying to convince himself this was the kind of job he could do. It was not. Technically, he was overqualified for it. A structural engineering degree from Ohio State, 7 years in commercial construction management, 2 years running renovation projects for a mid-sized firm before the firm got acquired and his position was eliminated in the merger, along with 14 others. That had been 8 months ago. Since then, he'd taken what he could find: framing subcontracts, site assessments, a 3-week job helping a church hall expand its restroom accessibility. It all paid less than he needed and more than nothing, which was a distinction that had become very important to him in a short period of time. The Meridian job was accessible renovation. The building owner had a new tenant on the 4th floor, a company called Ashford Dynamics, and the tenant had specific requirements: widened doorways, a modified bathroom, a different elevator control panel height, changes to the conference room layout. All of it needed to comply with standards that Caleb could meet in his sleep, and the contract was worth $9,000, which was enough to cover Nora's school tuition through spring, plus 2 months of rent. Plus the rear tires on the truck that he'd been ignoring since January, because bald tires were a problem for future Caleb, and future Caleb was always somehow better funded. He had one meeting. The meeting was with the tenant. He got out of the truck. The lobby of the Meridian was the kind of lobby that told you something about the people who worked inside it. Glass, steel, clean lines. The security desk had a man named Roy, who checked Caleb's contractor ID with the slow, deliberate precision of someone who had been given authority over a small thing and had decided to treat it as a large thing. Caleb signed the log, took a visitor badge, and rode the elevator to 4. The 4th floor was almost entirely empty of furniture, except for a single large desk positioned near the far windows and 3 monitors arranged in a configuration that looked like someone had spent time thinking about optimal angles. The woman at the desk had her back to him when he stepped off the elevator. He could see the wheelchair, could see the dark hair pulled back without a loose strand. She was on the phone. She did not turn around. He stood near the elevator and waited. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the wall. When it ended, she turned her chair slowly and looked at him the way engineers looked at stress calculations, looking for the weak point. Diane Ashford was 38. The way she held herself made her look like she was expecting you to apologize for something. She had the kind of stillness that wasn't calm. It was control. "You're Mercer," she said. "I am. You're supposed to have submitted plans by yesterday." He had submitted plans yesterday. He knew this because he had sent the email himself at 4:17 p.m. and had the read receipt. He did not say any of this. "I can pull them up now if you want to walk through them together." She looked at him for a moment. "I've already read them." Then, "They're wrong." Caleb set down his bag. "What specifically?" "The conference room doorway. You widened it by 32 inches. The standard calls for 36. ADA minimum is 32. I can do 36. I factored 32 into the quote. 36 would add, "I know what it costs," Diane said. 36. Understood. The elevator panel relocation is also wrong. He had placed it at the ADA standard height. He said so. "ADA standard accommodates a range of users," she said. "I'm telling you where I need it." She gave him a measurement. It was 2 inches lower than the standard. 2 inches lower was better for her. He wrote it down. The bathroom grab bar configuration on the plans assumes a right-hand transfer. I transfer left. He hadn't known that. There was no way to know that from a standard assessment. He rewrote the notation. She watched him write without expression. I'll revise and resubmit by end of day. By noon, she said, and went back to her monitors. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, Roy gave him the particular look of a man who had seen this before. Caleb nodded at him, signed out, and walked to the parking structure. He sat in the truck again, this time for 2 minutes. Not because he needed convincing, but because he needed to breathe. The specs were demanding, but not unreasonable. Everything she'd corrected was either technically valid or a legitimate personal preference. She was right about the grab bar. She was right about the elevator panel. She was almost right about the doorway, and he'd have given her the 2 extra inches if she'd asked differently. He had a client who was going to push on everything, correct him on half of it, and be right about most of those corrections. He dealt with worse. He dealt with clients who were wrong about corrections and argued about it for 3 weeks while the project bled money. This was different. She was difficult and accurate, which was exhausting in a specific and manageable way. He revised the plans. He sent them at 11:42. She replied at 11:55 with a single additional note about the threshold strip between the hallway and the conference room. The reply ended without a greeting and without a thanks. He corrected the note. He started ordering materials. Caleb had not always lived the way he lived now, running on thin margins and thinner patience. Eating lunch standing at a job site because there was nowhere to sit, and not enough time anyway. He had been, for a stretch of years in his late 20s, the kind of man who bought his daughter's birthday gifts 3 months early and had money in savings, and came home at 6:30 most nights to a house where someone was already making dinner. That had been Anna. Anna Mercer, who had died at 32 from a pulmonary embolism that no one had seen coming, that no doctor had flagged, that had simply been there inside her all along, waiting for a Tuesday afternoon in March. Nora was 4. Caleb was on site in Dayton when the call came, and he drove the 2 hours home with his hands locked on the wheel and something in his chest that had never fully unclenched since. He still carried the brass compass Anna's father had given her as a kid. She'd pressed it into his palm on their last morning together. She was running late. She didn't have a pocket for it. She'd said take it, and he'd put it in his jacket without thinking about it, and he had carried it every day since. It was not a practical object. It did not help him find his way anywhere. He just needed to know it was there. 3 years after Anna died, he was in a rebuilt life. Not a diminished one. He refused to think of it as diminished. But different. Nora was 7 now, and extraordinary in the specific way of children who have lost one person and decided to love everyone else twice as hard. She drew maps, not of real places, but of invented ones. Streets with names she made up, neighborhoods populated by people she named after things she liked. The latest was a street called Compass Lane. He hadn't told her why that made him feel the way it did. He needed this job. Not just the 9,000. He needed the months of steady work. Because the Ashford Dynamics renovation wasn't just the 4th floor. There was a potential follow-on contract for 2 other floors if the 4th went well. That was a possibility he did not let himself calculate too carefully, because he'd learned that counting money you didn't have yet was a fast way to get blindsided. He showed up Monday morning at 7 to start the preliminary demo work. Just him and one laborer he'd subcontracted, a man named Pete, who was efficient and did not talk much, which were his 2 most useful qualities. Diane Ashford was already there. She was always already there when he arrived. She watched him work for 15 minutes before she spoke. The wall you're opening. You're going too far to the right. He was not going too far to the right. The measurements were marked. He showed her the markings. She looked at them. She looked at the wall. She looked at him. Fine, she said, and returned to her desk. He understood this was not going to get easier. But here was the thing. Caleb had spent 3 years doing what was difficult. Getting up when Nora called in the night. Going back to work when his gut said it was too soon. Taking the smaller jobs when the right jobs weren't there. He had a very specific tolerance for doing hard things that hadn't made sense yet. And there was something about Diane Ashford's precision, even the hostile precision, that read like someone who had been let down by people who didn't pay attention. Her corrections were not cruel. They were informed. She knew what she needed, and she knew when she wasn't getting it, and she said so immediately, which was actually a quality he respected, even when it arrived this way. He did not tell her that. He fixed the grab bar configuration. He installed the elevator panel at her specified height. He widened the conference room doorway to 36 inches and added a full inch of clearance on the hinge side, because she hadn't asked for it, but it would make the difference. She noticed. She didn't say so, but she noticed. He could tell by the way she measured it with her eyes on her way through and said nothing. Saying nothing, he was beginning to understand, was her version of adequate. The second week was when she started testing him in a different way. Not with corrections, those continued. Every day had at least two. Some were valid. Some were the kind of thing that wasn't wrong, but also wasn't right, just different, and he adjusted to her preference either way because it was her space and she had to live in it. But the testing in the second week was something else. She assigned him tasks outside the scope of the contract. Not outrageously, nothing that required renegotiating the whole project, but small additions that were technically his problem to solve. On Tuesday, she wanted the threshold strip he'd installed replaced with a different style. He'd installed exactly what the spec called for. The new style she wanted cost more, took longer, required a different adhesive. He replaced it. He absorbed the material cost without saying anything. On Thursday, she told him the recessed lighting he'd positioned was throwing a shadow at a specific angle that was problematic when she was working at her desk. He measured the shadow, moved the fixture 4 inches, tested it. It was better. She was in the building for 10 hours every day he was there, sometimes 12. She took no visible lunch break. She was on her phone or her monitors constantly. She managed, he could piece together enough from overheard calls and the occasional document left on the conference room table. A company that deployed supply chain AI for mid-sized logistics firms. It was complex, precise work. She talked to engineers and analysts and regional managers, and she never softened her language for any of them. When something was wrong, she said so. When something was on track, she moved to the next thing. He watched her work the way he watched structural problems, looking for the pattern. She managed the wheelchair with zero self-consciousness, which told him something. Not that she'd accepted it, he was not that naive, but that she'd had 2 years to make it part of how she moved through the world, and she had done that. The chair was a tool. Functional, clean, operated with precision. She talked to clients from it, and ran board calls from it, and reviewed plans from it, and not once in 2 weeks did she behave as if the chair was the most important thing about her. Which it wasn't. He was nearly sure about that. He did not say any of this to her. On Friday afternoon of the second week, he was running conduit in the accessible bathroom when he heard raised voices from the main office. He couldn't make out words. He finished the conduit run and went back to his materials list. By the time he packed up, the office had been silent for 20 minutes, and Diane was at her desk, reading something printed on paper, marking it with a pen. On his way out, he said, "I'll be here Monday at 7. She said, "The bathroom tile." He stopped. "The grout line on the east wall," she said. "It's off by enough to be visible." He had done the tile work himself. He went back and looked. The grout line was off. Not dramatically, but she was right. It was visible once you looked for it. It would bother her every time she used the room. "I can regrout that section Monday morning. Do it before 8, she said. "I have calls from 8. He came in at 6:30 Monday and had the section regrouted and cured by 7:45. He was cleaning up when she rolled in at 7:50, paused in the bathroom doorway, looked at the wall, and said nothing. He packed his tools. "It's acceptable," she said. She was already in the main office. He had been told his work was acceptable. He went and got his coffee. That was week 3. In week 3, something shifted, so slightly that he almost missed it. It started with a question. Not a correction, a genuine question. She came and stood in the conference room doorway while he was adjusting the lever-style door handle, and she said, "What did you do before this?" He looked up. "Before contracting? You have an engineer's eye. The way you look at a space before you touch it." He told her about Ohio State, about commercial construction management, about the firm. She listened without interrupting. "They downsized you," she said. merger, and you rebuilt on your own. I'm rebuilding. There was a difference. He said it plainly. She looked at the doorway he'd been adjusting. Why the lever handles everywhere? The contract spec says standard. Lever handles are easier to operate with one hand or a closed fist. Standard round knobs require fine motor grip. You might have days when that matters. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't request that. No, another moment. Leave them, she said, and went back to her desk. In the 4th week, Nora was sick on a Thursday. Not seriously. A fever and a sore throat. The ordinary kind of sick that every 7-year-old got every winter. Caleb's mother was in Akron, and the neighbor who sometimes covered in emergencies was at a funeral. He called Pete and asked him to start without him, put Nora in front of the television with soup, and left by 10 once her fever had come down and she was asleep again. He got to the building at 10:20. Diane was in the middle of a call. He gave her a nod and went to the bathroom to continue the mirror installation. At noon, she appeared in the doorway. You're late. Family situation this morning. I let you know by text. The mirror is crooked. He looked at it. It was level. He offered her the level. She looked at it. At the level. At the mirror. She said, the reflection is off. The mirror is level. If the reflection looks tilted, it's because the ceiling isn't perfectly flat. This is a renovation in an older building. She looked at the ceiling. Something crossed her face that was not quite annoyance. He thought it was something more like frustration with a thing that wasn't anyone's fault. Your daughter, she said. He said yes without elaborating. How old? 7. She went back to the main office. He finished the mirror. At the end of that week, he was packing his tools by the elevator when she said from her desk, without looking up, You've been here 4 weeks. I have. Most contractors on this floor have left by the 2nd week. He didn't ask why. He said, I'll be back Monday. She said nothing. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, Roy looked up from his desk. Still standing, Roy said. Still standing, Caleb agreed, and walked to the truck. What he did not tell Roy, what he did not tell anyone, was that 4 weeks in, something had been happening that he was going to have to be careful about. It was nothing as clean as liking her. It was more like he had started to see the shape of what she was working against, not the wheelchair, something older and more complicated. The way she held people at a specific distance, the way she knew exactly how far to push before they left and pushed exactly that far. She was not trying to keep him. She was trying to confirm something. And every time he came back, she had to recalculate. He came back. There was a photograph on the windowsill of her office. He'd noticed it in the 1st week, but hadn't looked at it directly. In week 4, he glanced at it while running a measurement near the window and saw that it showed a younger Diane standing on what looked like a hiking trail, arm around someone whose face was slightly out of frame. She was grinning in it. Full, real, the grin of someone who isn't thinking about being observed. He looked at the photo for exactly as long as it took him to note what it was, and then he looked away and didn't look again. But it stayed in his mind. The specific evidence of a version of her that still existed somewhere in a photo turned slightly to face the window. In week 5, she had a physical therapy session in a room that the building manager had arranged on the 2nd floor. Caleb had installed the grab bar configuration down there 3 weeks earlier, modified per her specifications. He didn't know the session was happening until he heard the elevator and glanced at the time, 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, which was when she usually had no calls. He went on with his work. When she came back at 3:15, she moved differently, not worse. Charged, somehow like she'd done something that cost her and had decided not to be diminished by the cost. She came directly to where he was working. The closet built in, she said. The top shelf is too high. It was at the standard height. She couldn't reach the standard height. He looked at the spec he'd been given and understood that this was not the spec's error. This was someone who had approved a spec built for a person who no longer used her body the same way. I can drop it by 8 inches, he said. Give you 2 lower shelves instead of 1 tall one. She looked at the closet. The storage capacity would be the same? Same capacity, different configuration. He pulled out his tape measure and sketched it in his notes. Showed her. She looked at the sketch with the focus she gave everything. Do it, she said. He noticed she didn't say she should have caught it herself. She just moved to what needed to happen. That was something. He wasn't sure exactly what, but it was something. Toward the end of week 5, on a Friday, he arrived to find her in the conference room. Not at the table, facing the window, and she was very still in the way that wasn't productivity. The kind of still that happened when someone was holding something in. He went to his work. He didn't speak. He ran the cable conduit for the updated AV setup she'd requested and didn't make a sound that wasn't necessary. After about 20 minutes, she said, without turning around, "Do you know what the company does?" "Supply chain AI," he said. "Mid-market logistics. We automate routing and load balancing decisions for companies that can't afford enterprise-level systems. We built something that works for the middle tier." A pause. "I built it. I know." She turned. Not all the way, just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "My brother is on the board. Martin, he was there from the beginning. He thinks," she stopped, "he thinks the company is at a point where leadership needs to change." Caleb said nothing. He ran another cable. "He thinks I'm distracted," she said. "By recovery. By the renovation. By not being the version of me that built the company." He could say a lot of things. He said one. Is he wrong? The question landed. He saw it in the way her shoulders changed. "No," she said. "But not in the way he means." He filed that away. He didn't ask what way she meant. He had the sense that she wasn't finished thinking it through herself, and pushing would close it. He just let it sit. 3 days later, she had a call with someone he gathered was a specialist. He heard enough to know it was medical in nature, heard the words protocol and regimen and timeline. Her voice during the call had a careful quality that it didn't have during business calls. More controlled. The kind of controlled that was working to cover something. The call ended. She was quiet for a while. Then, she said, "Mercer, yeah, the cabinet configuration in the break room. You put the pull handles on the lower cabinets but not the upper." He had. The upper cabinets were above her reach height and he hadn't wanted to add hardware she couldn't use. "I want them on the upper cabinets as well," she said. "For when I can." He heard that. He wrote the note. He didn't make anything of it. No reaction, no comment. He just wrote the note and went on working. That night, sitting at the kitchen table after Nora was in bed, Caleb thought about those 5 words. For when I can. He thought about what it took to say them out loud to a contractor you hadn't decided to trust. The whole thing had to live somewhere inside her. The hope. The plan. The specific possibility she was holding without letting anyone see the shape of it clearly. He ordered the hardware for the upper cabinets. He installed it the next day. She ran a hand along the upper cabinet the way she'd done with the conference room doorway, checking the measurement with her eyes, the way she measured everything. She said nothing. He knew what nothing meant by now. Martin Crew arrived on a Tuesday in what had become week 7, unannounced from what Caleb could tell, because Diane's posture changed the moment the elevator opened and Martin stepped off. He was 52, large, with the particular combination of easy warmth and structural confidence that Caleb associated with people who had spent a long time being the most important person in most rooms. He wore a jacket that fit well and shook Caleb's hand with the grip of a man who wanted you to know he had a grip. "You must be the contractor," Martin said. "Caleb Mercer." Martin gave the 4th floor a long look, the renovated doorways, the new handles, the modified layout. His expression was the expression of a man doing math. "Impressive work. Thank you." "How much longer?" 12 to 14 days for punch list items. Martin turned to Diane with a smile that was meant to look warm and did. Mostly, didn't I say? Get the right people in, and it goes fast. Diane's expression did not match his tone. "It's not fast," she said. "It's thorough." There was a distinction in that. Martin chose not to hear it. Caleb went back to his work. He positioned himself at the far end of the space and kept his attention on the task at hand. He could hear the conversation between Diane and her brother at the edges, Martin's voice measured and reasonable, Diane's clipped and economical, the way she talked when she was managing how much she gave. Martin stayed 2 hours. He took the elevator down alone while Diane remained at her desk. After the elevator closed, she was quiet for a long time. Then he wants to restructure the leadership model. Caleb didn't pretend not to have heard the earlier conversation. Your role? Specifically, she moved to the window. Columbus in November was gray and flat, the kind of cold that committed. He's proposing a co-CEO structure. A COO elevated to shared decision-making authority on major contracts. It sounds reasonable on paper, but it isn't. It's how you manage someone out without removing them. You give them a title and a smaller room. She looked at the street below. I know this because it's what I proposed once to a department head who was costing the company money but had too much institutional knowledge to fire outright. A pause that had some honesty in it. It worked. Caleb set down his tools. Does he have the board behind him? He has 2 members. I have 3. There's one undecided. She turned from the window. The undecided one is a woman named Petra Long. She's known me for 12 years. She's also known Martin for 12 years. She's going to make up her mind based on whatever she sees in the next 60 days. Then what does she see in 60 days? Diane looked at him the way she'd been looking at him lately when he asked direct questions, slightly startled, then recalibrating. She sees a CEO running a company through a recovery period. Either it's reassuring or it isn't. What makes it reassuring? Growth. A new initiative. Something that signals the company isn't standing still. She said it the way she said things she'd already figured out and was now running past someone to hear how it sounded out loud. We've been building toward an accessibility consulting vertical for 2 quarters. The data is there. The market gap is real. I've been sitting on it because... She stopped. Because? Because launching something new while your brother is circling the board for signs of weakness is a way to give him ammunition if it goes wrong. Caleb picked up his tools again. He worked for a moment, then said, or it's a way to give him a clear answer. She didn't reply immediately. She went back to her desk and he went back to his work, and neither of them said anything about it for the rest of the day. But at the end of the afternoon, when he was packing up, he noticed she had printed something. A document, several pages, and it was on her desk with a pen beside it, like she was planning to read it tonight. He found out the shape of it in pieces over the next 2 weeks, because Diane Ashford did not announce things. She thought out loud in his general direction when she'd already reached a conclusion and wanted someone to hear it before she committed. She told him about the accessibility vertical in segments, 1 fact at a time. The market gap was real. He looked it up one evening after Nora was in bed and confirmed it. Most mid-sized companies had accessibility compliance requirements they met minimally, just enough to avoid legal exposure. What didn't exist was a firm that helped them close the gap between technical compliance and actual usability. A firm that understood both the infrastructure and the human experience. That was a niche. A real one. On the Monday of week 8, Martin Crew came back. This time he brought someone, a man he introduced as a consultant the board had engaged to review operational structure. The consultant was polished and efficient, and spent 40 minutes in the space taking notes on a tablet while speaking to Martin in a low voice. Caleb ran a trim detail near the conference room and kept his head down. But he was listening. The consultant said, twice, the recovery timeline adds uncertainty, and Martin said, that's the concern, yes. And Diane said, across the room clearly, my recovery timeline is my concern. Martin left again at noon. Diane worked through lunch in the particular focused way that wasn't productivity. It was a person working through anger with the only tool that helped them. She took 3 calls in 90 minutes and handled all 3 with precision and no warmth, which wasn't unusual, but the edges were a little sharper today. At 2:30, she called Caleb over to her desk. He came and stood beside it. She pulled up a document on her second monitor. Tell me what you see, she said. It was a proposed renovation plan for the rest of the building, not just the 4th floor, the 2nd and 3rd floors. The lobby. A comprehensive accessibility overhaul, the kind of project that was 8 weeks minimum and would require a full subcontractor team. He looked at it for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he said, this wasn't in the original scope. No, the lobby ramp approach, this section here, won't work with the existing structure. The concrete is poured to a slope that'll cause problems if you try to add the ramp at this angle. You'd need to tie into the curb differently. She pulled out a notepad. "Show me." He drew it. They spent 45 minutes on the structural details. She asked good questions. She caught one thing he missed. He corrected it and said, "You have an engineer's eye yourself. I have a logistician's eye. Same function, different object." She set the notepad down. "I want you to bid the full project." He looked at her. "The building owner, I lease. I can sublet the renovation to the building owner as a building-wide accessibility improvement that benefits multiple tenants and meets the city's newer code updates. The economics work. They just need to be presented correctly." He thought through the project scope. It was real work. Serious work. The kind he hadn't had in 8 months. "I'll need a full week to price it properly." "You have until Friday." He started that night. The mid-story setback arrived on the Wednesday of week 9, and it arrived through a letter. Caleb found out about it indirectly. He arrived at 7 to find Diane already in the conference room, not working. The letter was on the table. He saw it because she had printed it and left it where she was reading it, and when she heard him come in, she didn't move to cover it or put it away. She just looked at the window. He went to start his work. He wasn't going to ask. She said, "Martin has engaged an employment attorney." He set down his bag. "He's proposing to the board that any project commitment above a specific dollar threshold requires joint signatory authority. Co-signed by the CEO and a board-approved co-executive." She was still looking at the window. "The co-executive in question is proposed as Martin. Can he do that?" "With 4 board votes, yes, he has 2. He needs 2 more." A pause. "Petra is 1. He waited. "He's also made a recommendation to the building owner that the full renovation project I've proposed should be put on hold pending the board resolution," which the building owner, who has 2 board members on his corporate advisory board coincidentally, agreed to this morning. The full renovation project. That was the bid Caleb had been building for 3 days. His full team, 2 months of work, the contract that would cover the next year. Gone. Not because anything had gone wrong. Because the right people knew the right people and had put the right pressure on the right places. He sat down on one of the conference room chairs. He did not say anything immediately because there was nothing immediately useful to say. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the project." She looked at him. Not at the letter. At him. Something in her face that he hadn't seen before. "It was the right project," she said. "The market need is real. The scope was correct." She said it like she was determining what was salvageable. "I should have moved faster before Martin had time to position. You can still move. Just differently." How? He thought about it. He thought about what he knew about her company. About the niche she'd described. About what he knew about accessible renovation. Not just as a contractor, but as someone who had spent years looking at spaces that didn't work for people who needed them to. You don't need the building contract. You need the consulting model. The renovation was the proof of concept. But the advisory side doesn't need the same capital, it doesn't need board approval for a threshold spend, and it can be structured as a separate entity that you control independently of Ashford Dynamics. She was quiet. "A separate consulting firm," he said. "One that happens to have the founder of a supply chain AI company on its founding team." She looked at the letter again, not with the same expression as before. Calculating now, working through something. "That would require a co-founder," she said. "Someone with operational renovation experience. Infrastructure knowledge." He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for 3 seconds that were very loud in the way of 3 seconds that changed something. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her expression went flat in a different way. She answered it. "Martin," Caleb went back to his work. He heard her say once, "Clearly, I understand your position. And later, I'll consider it. And at the end, we'll speak again." He was packing up to leave when she came to where he was working. She stood in the doorway of the newly finished, accessible bathroom. The one with the correct grab bar, the correct mirror, the corrected grout. "He made an offer," she said. Caleb finished packing his bag. "A personal offer, not a board action. $1 million. Enda, he wants me to accept the co-executive structure, pull back from day-to-day operations, and in exchange he provides private funding to make the transition comfortable." She said it in her reading a fact voice. Stripped, he framed it as looking out for me. And the offer is for you to accept, Caleb said. The offer? She stopped. The offer is also contingent on eliminating external relationships that he believes are creating instability. She looked at him directly. That includes you. There's a figure attached. He wants to buy out your contract, pay off your remaining scope, and add what he called a consideration amount. Caleb was very still. $1 million, Diane said, for you to leave the project and sign an ENDA covering your time here. He thought about his checking account. He thought about the truck tires, about Nora's tuition, about the year he'd just had. He thought about $1 million, which was a number so far outside his current reality that it felt like a word from another language. No, he said. She looked at him. No, he said again, and the second one was quieter and had more in it. You don't need to decide tonight. I decided. He zipped his bag. He stood up. He's trying to remove the people around you who aren't in his pocket. If I leave, who's next? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He heard her say, from behind him, very quietly, why? He thought about that, about all the possible answers. He chose the one that was most accurate and least complicated, because this is the first job in 8 months that's worth doing right. He stepped into the elevator. I'll be here Monday. The doors closed. He sat in the truck for 5 minutes. His hands were completely steady. He was aware that they probably should not have been, given that he'd just turned down $1 million he very badly needed. But the steadiness was there, and it didn't feel like stubbornness. It felt like something much older than that. He pulled out Anna's compass. It sat warm in his palm, doing nothing practical, pointing nowhere useful. He put it back in his pocket. He went home and made dinner and listened to Nora tell him about the map she was making of a neighborhood called Compass Heights. And when he asked where she'd gotten the name, she said she'd found it in a dream. And he said that was a good place to find names for things. He came back Monday. The first thing he saw was that the photograph on the windowsill had been moved. Not removed, moved. The angle had changed slightly so it faced more toward the center of the room than the window. He noticed it and said nothing and went to work. Diane was on a call when he arrived. She was still on the call at 9, still on it at 9:40. And when it finally ended, she sat for 3 minutes with her hands flat on the desk and said nothing to the room. Martin called the other board members over the weekend, she said eventually. Did you expect him to? Yes, she pulled up something on her screen. He's proposing the board vote be moved up. January instead of March. That was 11 weeks sooner. Caleb ran the calculation. Is that enough time? It depends on what Petra sees. She typed something and stopped. It depends on what I give her to see. He had been thinking about the consulting venture since Thursday. He had spent the weekend, after Nora was in bed both nights, building out a rough model. Not detailed enough to be a business plan. Detailed enough to show the shape of it. I put something together, he said. She looked up. He crossed the office and put 4 handwritten pages on the edge of her desk. Basic structure. Market positioning. 2 potential client profiles based on what I've seen contracting for the last 2 years. He paused. It's rough. She picked up the pages. She read them without speaking. She turned each one deliberately, went back to the second page and read a section twice. Moved to the third. This firm profile, she said, pointing to one of the client's sketches. A mid-sized distribution company expanding to a new facility. They need both the physical infrastructure work and the systems assessment. It's the kind of client that no one currently serves end to end. They get a contractor for the build side and a compliance consultant for the paper side, and neither of those people talk to each other. Which means the build doesn't serve the systems assessment, and vice versa. And we would do both. Under one engagement. She was looking at the third page now. He had sketched a revenue model. Very rough. She made a notation beside one line and pushed it back toward him. The hourly rate for the assessment side is too low, she said. You're valuing it as contractor time. It's consulting time. Those are different markets. He looked at her notation. She was right by about 30%. Groundwork, she said. He looked up. The name. She said it without any particular weight. For the firm. Groundwork Consulting. He thought about it. That's good. I know. She went back to her monitor. Get me a proper business plan by Thursday. He spent the next 3 days building it. It was the most he'd put into anything conceptual in years, since the structural analysis proposals he'd done at the firm, which were also the last time he'd been paid to think as well as build. He found he was good at it still. The thinking. The way a problem had to be mapped before it could be solved. On Thursday, he delivered 31 pages. She read it that afternoon. She had 11 revisions by evening. 8 of them were improvements. On Friday, she said, I want to have the legal entity formed before December. That's 3 weeks. 4. Can your attorney handle it? I don't have a business attorney. She gave him the name of hers. He met with the attorney on Monday. The entity could be structured by mid-December. Diane was putting in equity capital. She had personal funds separate from Ashford Dynamics that Martin couldn't touch. Caleb was contributing labor and technical expertise, which she had structured as a convertible ownership stake. He did not fully understand all of it and said so. The attorney explained it twice and it made sense the second time. He was going to be a co-founder of something. He was not entirely sure what to do with that. Nora's school closed early the second Friday of December. A plumbing situation that had started in the lower grade corridor and escalated, which schools were good at. Caleb got the call at 8:15. His mother was in Akron. The neighbor was at work. He did the mental math twice and landed in the same place both times. He told Diane by text that he had a family situation and would be bringing his daughter in, and that Nora would stay in the waiting area and would not disrupt the work. He received no response. He picked up Nora with her backpack and her sketchbook and the small pencil case she kept organized in a way her room was absolutely not. On the drive over, she asked where they were going, and he said a building he was working on, and she said, was it interesting? And he said it was fine, and she said fine wasn't interesting. He signed in with Roy, who looked at Nora and smiled in a way he'd never smiled at Caleb, and took them to the 4th floor. Nora walked off the elevator and stood completely still for 3 full seconds, which was what she did when she was deciding how a place felt. The 4th floor, renovated now, finished mostly, was wide and open, and the December light came through the windows at a low. Clean angle. It's quiet up here, Nora said. It's an office. Offices are usually loud. She was already looking at the windows. Diane was at her desk. She saw Nora and did not speak immediately. Nora saw Diane and did the same 3-second stillness thing she'd done with the room. Then Nora said, Hi, Diane said. I'm Nora. I'm sorry about the school. The school has a plumbing situation, Caleb said. I could have told them that was going to happen, Nora said. The drainage on the east side of that building is wrong. You can see it when it rains. Caleb looked at his daughter. How do you know that? Maps, she said. I mapped the whole block. She held up her sketchbook. To Diane, she said, Do you mind if I draw in here? No, Diane said. There was a quality in her voice he hadn't heard before. Not soft, just less hard than usual. Nora settled herself at the end of the conference table with her sketchbook, organized her pencils in the order she preferred, and started drawing. Caleb went to work. For 2 hours, the room had 3 people in it. Diane worked. Nora drew. Caleb finished trim on the last 2 doorways and tried to be quiet. The sounds were the scratch of Nora's pencil and the sound of Diane's keyboard and his own tools. At 11, Nora came and stood beside Diane's desk with her sketchbook. Can I show you something? She said. Caleb looked up. He did not intervene. He had learned from 7 years of being Nora's parent that intervening stopped things that were better left to happen. Diane looked at Nora. Show me. Nora put the sketchbook on the desk. She'd drawn the floor, not a picture of the room, a map. An actual spatial map, proportioned reasonably well for a 7-year-old, with all the renovated elements marked and labeled in her handwriting. I put your desk here, Nora said, and I made the door bigger because I could see it was bigger than the other ones. She pointed to the conference room doorway. This is the biggest one. Is that because of the wheelchair? Caleb said. Nora, yes, Diane said. Nora nodded in the way she nodded when things confirmed a working theory. The scale's off on this side, she said, pointing to the window wall. I know it. I couldn't fit the whole room. Here, Diane took a notepad from her desk and a pen. She drew a correction, very small, precise, showed Nora how the proportions changed. Nora studied it, nodded, made the correction in pencil. How do you know to draw like that? Diane said. With the proportions. My dad taught me. He says if you don't measure, you guess. And guesses have a way of being wrong in the most expensive possible direction. Diane looked at Caleb. He picked up his tape measure and went back to work. At noon, Roy himself came up with a bag from the deli around the corner. Unprompted, he set it on the conference room table and looked at Nora with enormous satisfaction. There were 3 sandwiches in the bag. Nora accepted hers with the gravity appropriate to a diplomatic reception. Thank you, she said. Diane ate at her desk. Caleb ate standing, which was his habit. Nora ate with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to get back to the map. After lunch, Nora brought something else to Diane's desk. Not the map this time. A drawing. The view from the window. The street below, the buildings across, the particular gray of Columbus in December rendered in pencil. She had labeled one building wrong, she explained. She'd made it 3 stories when it was 4. But the rest is right, she said. I counted the windows. Diane looked at the drawing for a long time, long enough that Nora just waited beside her, unhurried, the way she waited when she was genuinely curious about what someone was thinking. You counted the windows, Diane said. That's how you know the floors. Mostly, sometimes buildings are weird. Sometimes they are. Diane looked at the street level of the drawing, where Nora had sketched a woman in a wheelchair on the sidewalk. Simple, clearly meant to be Diane, viewed from above. Not a problem or a statement. Just a person in the drawing where a person belonged. Is that okay? Nora said. I can erase it if you don't want to be in it. No, Diane said. Leave it. Nora pulled herself up onto the chair beside the desk with the ease of a child who sits everywhere. My dad says, you built your company, she said. From nothing. I did. How? Diane looked at her. Caleb, across the room, kept very still and did not look at them. He filed nails. He was quiet. I had an idea, Diane said, and I worked on it until it worked. What if it didn't work? Then I would have worked on it more. Nora seemed to accept this. She swung her feet, which didn't reach the floor. My dad's like that. He works on things until they work. She picked up a pencil and tapped it against her palm. He says giving up is fine sometimes, but you have to be honest about why you're giving up. If you're giving up because it's bad, that's okay. If you're giving up because you're scared, that's different. Caleb had never said exactly that. He had said something like it once, about a different thing. And she had remembered it and made it into a principle she now distributed freely. He's right, Diane said. Nora looked at Diane's wheelchair with the direct, uncomplicated attention she gave everything. Does it feel weird? She said. Nora, Caleb said. It's okay, Diane said. To Nora, sometimes. Less than it did. My friend's grandpa uses a walker. He says the hard part isn't the walker, it's when people look at the walker instead of at him. She put the pencil down. I'm not doing that. I know, Diane said. Good, Nora said. She picked up the drawing and offered it to Diane. You can have this one. I have the map. Diane took it. She held it by the edge, carefully. The way you held something that was unexpectedly the right size for a space you hadn't known was empty. She put it on the windowsill, against the photograph. Caleb looked at the window from across the room and felt something he wasn't going to name land in the center of his chest and settle there. He packed up at 4:30. Nora had fallen asleep in the conference room chair with her sketchbook on her lap, and he carried her to the elevator. She was heavy and warm and made the small sound she made when she was sleeping hard. He was waiting for the elevator when Diane came to the edge of the main office. Mercer, she said. He stopped. What you said. Before, about why you didn't take the offer. She looked at him, and the look was not the calculating look and not the measuring look. It was something he didn't have a full name for yet. I believed you, she said. I want you to know that. I wasn't sure I was going to. He shifted Nora's weight. Okay, he said. The elevator came. He stepped in. The business plan, she said, is good. He let the doors close. He drove home with Nora awake now in the back seat, soft-voiced and not quite fully returned. asking where they were going, and then remembering and saying the lady with the wheelchair was really good at helping with drawings for someone who said she didn't know how to draw, and Caleb said she'd probably just never tried. And Nora said she seemed like she'd be good at anything she tried, and Caleb said he thought that was probably true. That night, he wrote the final version of the groundwork business plan. Not the client profiles, not the revenue model. The mission statement. He wrote 3 versions and looked at all of them and settled on the one that was most accurate, closing the gap between what compliance requires and what people actually need. He sent it to Diane at 9:45. She replied at 9:52. The name on the entity should be Mercer Ashford Consulting LLC-DB, a groundwork. In that order. You built this idea. The order should reflect that. He sat with that for a moment. He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling of his kitchen, which needed repainting, but not tonight, and thought about a woman who'd had 31 people leave before him and had stopped expecting them to stay, and had built her whole professional life on the assumption that she would do everything herself. He thought about the drawing on the windowsill. He thought about the compass in his jacket pocket. He texted back, "We can discuss the name." She sent back, "We will discuss the name. The LLC is filed as I've specified. We will discuss it after it's legal, and it will remain as I've specified." He put his phone away. He went to sleep. The board meeting was January 17th. Caleb was not in it. He was on the 4th floor running punch list items, the final details of the original renovation contract, and he worked the morning with the particular quiet of someone who understood that the thing happening 2 floors up was not his thing to control. Diane had spent 11 days preparing for it. He had been present for 6 of those days, not helping, exactly, she hadn't asked for help. But he'd been there, working, and she had thought out loud in his general direction 4 times, and twice he'd had something worth saying, and had said it, and she had written it down without comment, which meant it had been useful. Martin had the votes he'd been building toward. Diane had the data. Petra Lang had spent 45 minutes on a call with Diane the previous Thursday. He knew because Diane had told him afterward, which was different from before. She'd said Petra asked good questions. That was the entire debrief. He'd taken it as a positive sign. At 2:15, the board call ended. He knew because the conference room on 2 went quiet, and 15 minutes later, Diane came off the elevator on 4. She didn't speak immediately. She went to her desk. She looked at the view out the window. He kept working. "Petra voted with me," she said. He set down the screwdriver. 4-2. 4-2. She turned from the window. The restructuring proposal was rejected. Martin's co-executive authority provision was tabled indefinitely. She said it in the stripped voice, but underneath it was something that required more holding than usual. And groundwork? Groundwork is separate from the board action. It's already filed. She looked at him. 3 clients have inquired in the 2 weeks since the quiet launch. 1 is a real engagement. He nodded. The first site assessment is in February. A distribution company outside Toledo expanding to a new facility. She said it in the tone she used when something was confirming a prediction she'd made. They need infrastructure and systems, end to end. I know that profile. You wrote it. He almost smiled. She moved to the window again. On the sill, the drawing and the photograph side by side. She looked at them both for a moment. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the wall beside the window, specifically at the grab bar he'd installed in week 2, the one she'd corrected him on, the left-hand transfer configuration, the one he'd gotten right only because she'd told him exactly what she needed. "I've been working with a physical therapist," she said. "Dr. Anaya, 3 times a week. I didn't tell you. You didn't need to." "No." She looked at the grab bar. "She ran imaging in November. There's pathway activity that wasn't in my previous scans. My injury is incomplete in ways the earlier scans didn't fully characterize." She said the technical language the way she said technical language, precise and unsentimental. There's preserved function below the level. Most of it was dormant. Another pause. "It doesn't mean what I thought it meant." He was very still. "She's been working on reactivating the pathways." She turned to face him fully. "I stood last week." In her office. 22 seconds. He didn't say anything. He looked at her. She had the look on her face of someone who had done something that cost everything they had and had not broken doing it. Something that was not triumph, because triumph was the wrong size. Something quieter. The specific look of a person standing in a room they weren't supposed to be able to reach. I wanted you to know, she said, not because it changes anything operationally, because you put the pull handles on the upper cabinets. She held his gaze. For when I can. I wanted you to know you were right. He crossed the room. Not quickly. He stopped a few feet from her desk. He reached into his jacket pocket and set the compass on the corner of her desk. Brass, warm from his pocket, the needle still uncertain. She looked at it. Anna's, he said. My wife's father gave it to her. She gave it to me the last morning. He left a space. I carry it because I need to know it's there. Another space. I'd like you to have it. Not because you need navigation, because I think you already know where you're going, and I want you to have it anyway. She looked at the compass. She looked at him. Mercer, she said. Yeah, I don't know how to do this. I know. I'm not. She stopped. Stopped. The version of me you've been working with for 3 months is not a simple version. She's not going to become one. I know that too. She looked at the compass. She picked it up. She held it in her palm and the needle found its direction. 22 seconds, she said. Next week it'll be more, he said. She looked up. Probably he sat down in the chair beside the desk, not across from it, beside it. She turned the wheelchair slightly so they were facing the same direction. The window, the view, the drawing on the sill. They stayed like that for a while. She said eventually Nora should see the first groundwork site. In Toledo. In Toledo. She has an eye for spatial problems. I'd rather have her assessment of the layout than most engineers I've worked with. She's 7. She counted 4 floors by counting windows. Diane looked at him sideways. Bring her. He thought about his daughter, who mapped imaginary streets and had named a neighborhood after a compass she'd never touched. She'll want to document everything, he said. Good, Diane said. She should. The needle on the compass held steady in Diane's palm. Outside, the Columbus sky was doing what it did in January, flat and gray and indifferent to everything happening inside the Meridian building on Grant Avenue. All the decisions and refusals and things said too quietly for anyone else to hear. The photograph on the windowsill was now fully turned toward the room. There is a version of this story where it's about the money, about a man who needed it desperately and turned it down anyway, and was somehow rewarded for it, as if refusal is a currency that accrues interest. That version is neater. It has a moral that arrives with the ending and doesn't ask anything of you after. That's not what actually happened. What happened was harder to categorize and more worth the telling. A structural engineer with an empty checking account showed up to renovate a space for a woman who had spent 2 years making sure everyone around her understood that she did not need them. He showed up because he needed the work. He kept showing up because it was the right work. And because he had learned, in the particular education of the 3 years since his wife died, that doing the right work was the only way to stay intact. He was not trying to save her. He was trying to do the job. That's the part most people don't understand about this kind of thing. The rescuer narrative wants a clear direction of grace. Someone given, someone received. But what actually happened between Caleb Mercer and Diane Ashford had no clear direction. It was 2 people, both in the middle of something hard, both doing what they could with the tools the hardest years had left them. Diane had built a company from an idea and made it real. She had survived an accident and a recovery, and a brother who mistook her reduced capacity for defeat. She had learned to move through the world differently than she'd expected to, and done it without asking for anyone's pity, which was not because she didn't have hard nights. She had them. She would keep having them. The pathways in her body that everyone had told her were dormant were not dormant, and relearning them was not a clean process, and 22 seconds was both everything and still just the beginning. What she gave Caleb was the thing he hadn't known he was missing, the chance to build something again. not for someone else's company, but for something of his own. The chance to be seen as the person who had the ideas, not just the person who executed them. 3 years of holding himself together for Nora had flattened something in him that needed more dimension. Diane, who was constitutionally incapable of seeing a person as only what they were useful for, had looked at him across a job site and seen the rest. Nora understood all of it better than either of them, because she was 7 and had not yet learned to complicate simple things. She walked into a difficult woman's office with a sketchbook and drew what she saw and gave the drawing to someone who needed to see herself in a room without explanation or apology. She did not manage the encounter. She was just present in it. That was enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that ever is. The real question this story asks is not why Caleb turned down the money. The real question is what he saw that was worth more. He saw a woman who had been told what she couldn't do by everyone who was supposed to know, and had kept building anyway. Who had stood for 22 seconds in a physical therapy room and told almost no one. Not because she was ashamed, but because she was still deciding what it meant. Who had turned a photograph toward the room instead of away from it, and put a child's drawing on the windowsill and asked for pull handles on the upper cabinets. For when I can. He saw someone who had not given up. Who had just been very quiet about it. $1 million is a large amount. Large enough to change a life. To solve problems that feel permanent. To replace the things that urgency has stripped away. He left it on the table and stayed. Not because he was heroic. Not because he was better than the 31 who came before him. But because he had learned, in the slow, undramatic way that real things are learned, that some rooms are worth staying in, and some people are worth the building. And some things, once you refuse to abandon them, become exactly what they were always capable of being. The compass is on the windowsill in Columbus, Ohio, on the 4th floor of the Meridian building on Grand Avenue. It sits beside a drawing a 7-year-old made of a street seen from above, and a photograph of a woman standing on a hiking trail, grinning full and real. The needle holds steady. It has never pointed anywhere other than where it was always pointing.